This is the online lecture for Chapter 9 on elections in Bianco and Cannon, as promised. A discussion about the election process is more than just a discussion of how various candidates choose to run their campaign. In fact, I find that rather boring. Elections have become synonymous, though, with campaign ads and what makes a candidate win or lose, but all of those reasons are usually specific to the election. So what I intend to focus on in this chapter is the actual process. What are the formal components of the election process? Like, how often do we vote? What are the requirements to vote? The requirements to run for office and campaign finance, and then how do we decide who to vote for? So it'll be easy to describe to you everything but campaign finance, because campaign finance is just more than just regulating what candidates spend. Yes, it does boil down to regulating what candidates spend, but think about why we would even care. What happens if campaign finance is not regulated? Remember that when Congress passes legislation, what they're attempting to do is curb our behavior in some way. Any type of regulation is a way to force us to behave in a particular way that may make the system more fair, or it may create incentives for individuals to behave in a way that is better for our economy or our nation, or to keep people from just simply behaving badly. This is the case with campaign finance. So, as we discuss it later on, I'd like you to think critically about what such legislation is supposed to do. So what campaign finance regulation is supposed to do, what is it supposed to deter, and then think about whether or not it really works. Do the laws actually do what they're supposed to do, or do they have the intended effects? And you might even consider this topic for your term paper too. Now, last class we talked about a lot of the basics about elections, and just to be clear, let's go over those basics again briefly, so that way I can ease right on into a discussion of the rest of the chapter that we weren't able to get to. Our focus here is on federal elections, so we'll be discussing elections for the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, and, of course, the presidency. Now, a senator's term, meaning how long they serve in office before they seek re-election, is 6 years. However, we don't elect an entirely new Senate every 6 years. Instead, Senate elections are staggered. They take place every 2 years on even-numbered years. For example, in 2010, in 2012, 2014, and 2016, we will elect approximately 1/3 of the Senate. So every other election cycle, we elect about 33 senators. The representatives in the House are elected every 2 years. They serve a 2-year term. So we get a new House of Representatives essentially every 2 years. Again, every 2 years, an entirely new House is elected. Now, the House consists of 435 members. And if you think about it, remember when we discussed in our chapter on Congress that the Senate was more stable than the House. And this is why. Because there are so many members, and because they get reelected every 2 years, not staggered, the Senate is more stable than the House in terms of the rules. Only part of the Senate is reelected every 2 years, but again, the House is in upheaval every 2 years. Even if the same party is in charge whenever all the elections take place, rules can change and priorities can change too, changing the entire direction of the House. And of course you know that the president is elected every 4 years. Now we put all this information together, and every 4 years is a really important election year, because we elect not only a president, but we also elect 1/3 of the Senate and the entire House. So this is what the upcoming 2016 election will comprise of. Now, who's entitled to vote for these elections? Hopefully, you know. You have to register to vote, of course. But federal law mandates that voters must be 18 years or older, and a U.S. citizen. States have rather a lot of authority to determine who is eligible to vote. But under these certain conditions, federal law mandates that states cannot restrict eligibility based on race, color, prior condition of servitude, gender, failure to pay any taxes, and age with respect to persons who are 18 years or above. That said, most states have laws based on how long you've been a resident in the state before you can vote. And as we discussed last class, some states bar felons from voting. In the majority of states, though, a felon can regain his or her right to vote when his or her sentence is completed. So once they're out of jail, they can then vote again. In some states, an ex-felon must apply to have voting rights restored. But there are 2 states, Maine and Vermont, where felons never lose their right to vote, even while they're incarcerated. However, in Florida, Iowa, Kentucky, and Virginia, felons and ex-felons permanently lose their right to vote whenever they've committed the felony, which makes them felons. The only way they can vote again is with a pardon from the governor. Let's discuss a few more components to the U.S. federal election. Those were all really basic. First, we have what we call single-member districts. We talked about this last class. It's a big term for something very simple. It means that we divide areas up geographically, and in those geographic units, we elect one person. A single-member district. A district in which we vote on a single member to represent us. So every congressional district can only elect one person. And you may be wondering about the Senate, because every state gets 2 U.S. senators. So does that mean we are a double-member district in regards to the Senate? No. 2 senators from the same state are never elected in the same year. So in any election for the Senate, you'll always only be voting for one senator. As a reminder, going back to Chapter 11 on Congress, we discussed who divvies up the congressional districts. For most states, the state legislature makes this decision. Some states require bipartisan or nonpartisan commissions to oversee the actual line drawing. However, the state governor and the majority party leaders often control who's appointed to these commissions. There are a few states, Alaska, Arizona, California, Idaho, Montana, Washington. They select an independent commission to draw the lines, and congressional members may be a part of that committee or independent commission, but it's actually regulated in how much the congressional member can actually participate in drawing up the lines. They're more just a formal member without any formal duties. All right, now, when we have an election, who wins? Of course, it's the person with the most votes. This is called plurality voting. Again, something we talked about last Friday. Plurality voting means that whoever has the most votes gets elected, but the winner does not have to receive the most votes. For example, say 4 people are running for the same office in an election. The winner needs only to receive 26% of the votes in order to win. So Catherine, last class, pointed out that this isn't an ideal scenario because if we're electing individuals to represent us, and as in the scenario above, 74% of the district wanted a different representative, well, that's not very good representation. You're going to have 74% of your district that feels misrepresented. They simply didn't want that person to represent them. The alternative to plurality voting is majority voting. And in this case, a candidate needs a true majority to win, at least 51% of the votes. In an election, if no one receives at least 51% of the vote, then a runoff election will take place automatically. The runoff election is comprised of the top 2 candidates The runoff election is comprised of the top candidates in the majority election who received the highest number of votes. So then the runoff election takes place, and the citizens vote based on those 2 choices, whoever won the highest number of votes in the majority election. This means that to ensure if some individuals in a district can't get their first choice, or this is really meant to ensure, this is meant to ensure that if some individuals in a district can't get their first choice for who represents them, they may at least get their second choice of a candidate. Some states have majority elections at the state level, like for gubernatorial elections. A few states have majority voting with, of course, runoff elections for primary elections in federal elections. Hopefully you got all that. So these states are Arkansas, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Texas, Vermont, and Washington. They all use majority and, subsequently, runoff elections in some way, either at the state level election or, mostly, at the primaries in the federal elections. Specifically, in South Carolina, I should note that technically the parties run the primary elections, but they do operate using a majority vote. So a majority vote obviously precludes a runoff. But if there is no majority, then a runoff election is obviously necessary. We've already discussed primary elections and general election, but here's a quick recap. So remember that elections in general are a two-step process for representatives, senators, and even presidents. Actually, and presidents. The first step is always winning the nomination for your political party. This is the primary election. The second step is the general election. This is the big election that takes place that first Tuesday in November. All right, now let's go back. Let's discuss the primary just a little more with our attention towards the presidential primary. I mistakenly said in a previous class that primary elections take place in May, but that's not always the case. Primary elections take place during different times, depending on the state, during the first 5 months of an election year. So you probably recall hearing a lot about, during a presidential election, hearing a lot about the Iowa and New Hampshire primary elections. The reason is these two states just happen to be the first two states who have their party primary elections. Iowa and New Hampshire will hold the primary election in February, though the exact dates may vary. Subsequent states hold their elections after. They typically hold them after. Some even as deep into April and May. But being the first state to hold a primary for the presidential election holds a lot of power for whoever is selected as either party's presidential nominee. Here's what I mean. The earlier in the race, individuals or donors, important donors, may still be deciding who to support financially. Again, so earlier in the race, we have donors, important donors, still deciding on who to support financially. They want to support the winner, obviously. And surely then, too, when they decide who they're going to support, they will give them tons of money, hence support. Surely, though, I don't need to explain that more money means a better chance of winning in an election. The earlier that you can show, here's the thing, the earlier that you can show you're a viable candidate that has a good chance of winning the election, the more money and support you will get early on. The process is cyclical, okay? You see, if you, as a candidate, can show you can win by winning the primaries early, then you will get more money, which will help you win, which will make more people want to give you money so that you can win. So typically, whoever wins the Iowa primaries, they typically win the election overall. All right, so another important day for the primary elections is Super Tuesday. Surely you've heard of this. The exact Tuesday that we call Super varies because it depends on which Tuesday has the most state primary elections on that day. So Super Tuesday is the date that the largest number of states vote for the presidential primary. For the 2016 presidential election, Super Tuesday will take place on March 1st. It also just so happens that most of the states voting on this day is in the southeastern part of the United States. So some people are calling the upcoming 2016 election, or Super Tuesday, the SEC primary. Informally, of course, but it's still referred to as Super Tuesday. So let's continue discussing the primaries as they lead up to the general election and what happens in between. We select those presidential nominees in the primaries and the time that we vote for them in November. Once all the primary election results are in for the respective parties, Democrat, Republican, we have the nominating convention, and we talked about this last chapter. The nominating convention for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And these take place during the summer, and it's here that the parties will nominate, or the party's nominee, rather, will officially accept the party's nomination. A nominating convention implies that A nominating convention implies, obviously, that a decision will be made on who represents the party in the presidential election. Yes, that's right, but who votes? Well, delegates are sent from each state to the nominating convention. And you may ask, how can you become a delegate? Well, it differs from state to state. If the state is called a winner-take-all state, then the party organization at the state level selects the delegates to send. And all the delegates are from that particular party. Sometimes the candidate has individuals in each state Sometimes the candidate has individuals in each state hand-selected in case they win a state, ready to vote at the nominating convention for them. Of course, the expectation is that if you're selected as a delegate, you will vote for the individual who won in the primary election in your party. It's not required, but it is expected. For states that aren't winner-take-all, they allow only a percentage of voters to dictate who the delegates are. This is called proportional allocation, and I can say that more simply. Basically, proportional allocation is this. If the candidate gets 40% of the vote, then the state will send 40% of delegates to represent the candidate at that convention. The nominating convention is wrapped up into the National Party's convention. It happens every 4 years, the same place that they write the platform. The presidential nominee does not need to have his running mate elected, i.e. the vice president, at this time. And it's important to note that it is the decision of the presidential nominee as to who will serve that role. Now, we have campaigning between the two presidential candidates, or maybe three presidential candidates, if a third runs, like when Ross Perot campaigned vigorously during the 1992 election. They campaign until the election takes place on the first Tuesday in November. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise to you that the U.S. does not select its president based on a popular vote. Instead, of course, we have an electoral college. Whoever wins the majority of votes in one state, it gets all the electoral votes from that state. A state is given a specific number of electoral votes that's equal to the number of representatives they have in the House and the number that they have in the Senate, which is two for every state. So what should be obvious to you now is that the more populated the state, the greater number of electoral votes for that state. Florida has 29 electoral votes. That's a pretty heavily populated state. California is very populated. It has the most electoral votes, 55 actually, I think now. If a presidential candidate wins in that state by, let's use Florida as an example. A presidential candidate wins in Florida by just a hair, say 51%, then that candidate will receive all 29 electoral votes for that state, even though he won by, again, just 1%. So these are also called winner-take-all states. Technically, the election process is not over after the first Tuesday in November because the Electoral College from each state has to officially cast the vote for the president. The Electoral College is, of course, comprised of people. Florida has 29 people in their electoral college. Each one has one vote, and that person will vote for the candidate that received the most votes in the state. This process takes place on, and pay attention because it sounds very convoluted. The Electoral College votes the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, and then it's official. Although you can call it official beforehand too. It's not like there would be a surprise if Tuesday night, on the Tuesday night in November that the election's called, and then all of a sudden the electoral votes are in and some of the people defected from their state. That just doesn't happen. So where do the Electoral College delegates send their votes? They all go to the state capitol building in their respective states. Because we use an electoral college, it is entirely possible for a candidate to win a majority of votes when all the state's votes are added together. So basically, the popular vote. So it's entirely possible for a candidate to win the popular vote, but still lose the election. And this usually happens when there's a third party in the race that's just strong enough to take away a significant amount of votes from one party. It happened in 1992 during the Clinton-Bush-Perot election. Perot pulled tons of votes away from Bush, causing both of them to lose. Clinton, the winner, obviously, for 2 terms was president, received only 43% of the popular vote in the U.S., yet he still became president. This also happened in 2000 during the Bush-Gore election. Happened again earlier. John Quincy Adams was elected, but didn't win the popular vote. Happened with Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, and I've put all their pictures up because I know you don't know what Hayes or Harrison looks like. I even had to look them up. In short, Clinton, Bush, Adams, Harrison, and Hayes became president even though their opponent won the popular vote. And this is just how the Electoral College can work sometimes. Now, individuals who are really into making America more democratic want to do away with the Electoral College because, well, democracy and popular vote go hand in hand. In fact, after saying all this, to you the system may sound antiquated or even unfair, as I just described it. The fact is, though, there are reasons for keeping the Electoral College and reasons for doing away with it. If you have time, Google the pros and cons for having an Electoral College system. You can find a lot of academic sources. That's what I recommend. But for the sake of brevity, I've pulled a list of pros and cons from a website called OccupyTheory.com. This is a biased website, and I don't recommend that you take up blogs or these kinds of websites for the unadulterated or unbiased truth. However, I see that this article does a nice job of summing up the main arguments, so I'm going to use their summation. All right. So let's talk about the advantages of the Electoral College. Why do we still have it if it's so bad? The first reason, or first advantage, is that you can prevent a victory for a candidate that's solely based on urban regions. Let me say that again. You can prevent a victory that's only based on really heavily populated urban regions. Here's what I mean. People who are in favor of the Electoral College claim that the present system avoids a candidate from winning through solely focusing on areas that are heavily populated. The Electoral College makes the candidate take a more extensive approach. Otherwise, you might have a president campaigning in Texas, and because they have just tons of people. The same goes for the other more populated states. So in that case, a candidate might only care about the opinions of the more heavily populated areas. If you're in an urban region, you will get campaigned to. If not, the candidates may not care about your vote. A second advantage is that the Electoral College allows states to vary their rules in voting eligibility and requirements. So this essentially assists in federalism, making sure that states have a say in how elections are held in their state. So this system, the Electoral College system, gives each state free will that they need to design its individual laws with respect to voting, and provides them with the ability to make amendments to these laws. Of course, these are subject to the main federal laws that you have to be 17 and older to vote, 18 years and older to vote, and then you have to be a U.S. citizen. The third advantage is that the Electoral College helps maintain a division of powers. This may not be readily apparent, so I'll explain. Division of powers, I mean separation of powers. So again, third advantage is that the Electoral College helps maintain the separation of powers. So we know that our government is purposely divided up into 3 different branches that are designed to offer checks and balances along with deliberation, ambition counteracting ambition. Well, certain proponents of the Electoral College argue that when the president is directly elected, he can declare a national well-known mandate, which will undermine the other branches of the government. What's more likely, it may probably lead to tyranny, or at least that's the argument. So this national well-known mandate refers to the president having what they call a popular mandate, that if they were elected overwhelmingly by the majority of the people, then Congress and the other branches of government should listen to the president, because listening to the president is simply listening to the people. And that can happen more directly if there's a popular election. Fourth, the advantage of the Electoral College promotes a 2-party system, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So a lot of people consider the negative effects of the Electoral College on third parties as really good, because it helps maintain the 2-party system that we have. And with the 2-party system, the country is more stable. We're not shifting from one political ideology to the other. We're simply switching from Republican to Democrat sometimes, or sometimes just staying the same. So the change is minimal, adding more stability. Finally, it's argued that minority groups have a greater chance of impacting an election if we have an electoral college. Some people argue that interest groups, minority groups, can have a huge impact in influencing votes because of the winner-take-all system within the states. That's their argument. The disadvantages of the Electoral College. There are fewer, but some disadvantages. Those who argue against it say that the electoral system it is made to where candidates would really only campaign in swing states. So again, we have sort of the mirror of one argument for Electoral College here. In the majority of states, candidates have the majority of votes. The candidate having the majority of votes acquires all the electoral votes of that state. Okay, that's how it is now. Well, a few states, actually several states, hold a long history of voting either consistently Democrat or consistently Republican. We call those red states or blue states. So when we have the Electoral College, candidates pay less attention to those states that are strictly Democrat or strictly Republican, and they pay more attention and tend to favor and campaign in the bigger states. The big states meaning the ones that are the swing states. The second disadvantage is that the Electoral College is said to discourage voter turnout. So while the candidate having the highest common vote in every state acquires the entire electoral vote within the state, voters will usually feel that their vote takes no effect because that state already maybe votes Democrat all the time or votes Republican all the time. If you're in a Republican state and you're a Democrat, you may feel the need not to vote. So the electoral system in that case doesn't really motivate candidates from campaigning for the turnout of voters. Well, for campaigning for the turnout of voters, except in these big swing states. So we get a lot of people that get a lot of utility from voting in swing states. Not so much in other states, though. All right, so finally, the Electoral College is said to favor the smaller and less populated states. This system of the Electoral College offers power to, again, small, less populated states, which means it's unfair for the larger states because the smaller states have a disproportionate effect. It simply improves the small states' electoral strength. And traditionally, the electoral strength has been in favor of the Republican Party because most smaller, less populated states usually identify as Republican. We're talking here states like South Dakota, Montana, that are expansively large but aren't as heavily populated as some of the more urban areas. Arguably, in my opinion, one of the most compelling arguments for the Electoral College, is the stability that it's said to provide, further encouraging a two-party system, which means that every time we get a new president, it doesn't mean that we get this huge, drastic regime change. All right, now let's switch gears. We're going to talk about campaigns, but not attack ads or silly decisions that candidates have made. Instead, let's talk about how money influences the election process and the legislation that regulates campaign funds. All right, pay really close attention to this next point. Quite frankly, you might want to pause this video to prepare yourself for this incredible insight that I have on campaigns, and I'm about to tell you it. Now would be a good time to pause the lecture in order to prepare yourself if you need to. So if you're going to pause it now. All right, welcome back to those of you who paused the lecture. I hope you prepared yourself. What I'd like to reveal to all of you is that money is incredibly important in winning an election. Yes. Compare a poor candidate running for election against a rich candidate. Highly likely that the rich candidate will win. However, compare a rich candidate to a richer candidate, and sometimes variables other than money may be more influential. But this is why campaign finance is so important to understand. So, campaign finance, according to your book, refers to money collected for and spent on campaign and elections by candidates. It could be political parties, or it could be other organizations and individuals. So, campaign finances are heavily regulated by the Federal Elections Commissions, and that particular agency, it's an independent regulatory agency, was created in 1975, just after Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Now, like any bureaucratic agency, they enforce and regulate based on legislation that Congress passes. Now, the most recent legislation dealing with campaign finance was passed in 2002. This is known as the McCain-Feingold Act, or the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. I might refer to this as the BCRA, Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. However, aside from this legislation, the Supreme Court has subsequently ruled on a few provisions of this act that's changed it. So we've had a few big changes since the act was passed in 2002. There are a few prominent changes that took place from the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act that I'd like to focus on. It limits how much contribution certain groups, individuals can give, and it provides more regulation of soft money. So there are two general types of money or political donations. We have soft money and hard money. Hard money is very easily defined as donations that are used to specifically elect or defeat a candidate. So say you run an ad and you're saying that Donald Trump is really, really bad. You have better used hard money for that campaign ad because that's what it's allowed for. Soft money contributions. These are contributions that can be used for things like voter mobilization, or maybe it's to promote a particular policy proposal or to promote a particular point of view. And as long as the money isn't used to support or oppose a candidate specifically, it's counted as soft money. So, soft money is thought of as money raised outside the limits of federal campaign finance law. So, once again, federal campaign finance law regulates hard money. Soft money, which money that technically doesn't have anything to do with campaigns, aren't regulated in the same way. Again, they're not to support or oppose a candidate. They're supposed to be used for things like voter mobilization, so on. So essentially, they don't have to do with campaigns per se, as I just said. So obviously, these two types of money, hard money, soft money, have different rules associated. What the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002 did, it actually included several provisions designed to end or regulate the use of soft money on the grounds that it affects the outcomes of federal elections. So it should be treated as similar to hard money. For example, an organization may be using soft money to support a particular policy, but if a particular candidate is associated with that policy, then arguably the ad is indirectly in support of a candidate. So you can kind of see their point of view. Soft money, though, was the way that politicians and political organizations got away with spending money that wasn't subject to campaign finance laws until BRCA. The legislation prohibited, and this is from the Federal Elections Commission's website, they sum up really well what BRCA did. The legislation prohibited national party committees from soliciting or receiving soft money. So national party committees can't solicit funds for or make direct donations to any kind of, say, tax-exempt organization like a nonprofit, if the organization is going to use that money or if they do use that money in connection with a federal election, including federal election activity. Like, essentially, it's keeping national parties from laundering money through those organizations to let somebody else spend the money for or against a candidate because the National Party Committee can't because it's against the law. Hopefully that made sense. National party committees could no longer freely solicit funds or make donations to. Now, before we talked about 501c organizations, those are nonprofits, but now we're talking about 527 organizations. So they can't solicit funds or make direct donations to 527 organizations. A 527 is a tax-exempt group established to raise unlimited money for general political activities like voter mobilization efforts. An example, MoveOn.org, that's a 527 group. And as one, they are prohibited, though, from directly supporting or opposing a specific candidate. The Act, the BRCA, BCRA, the Act regulated advocacy ads or issue ads too. They began to define them as electioneering. So if they included the name of a federal candidate, and these ads were broadcasted within 30 days of a primary or 60 days of a general election, no-go. They weren't allowed to. So the legislation also prohibited any issue or advocacy ad under the same restrictions, even if the ad was paid for by a corporation or a nonprofit organization like the Right to Life or the Environmental Defense Fund, or even paid for by an unincorporated entity using any corporate or union general treasury funds. So, I mentioned earlier that 2 Supreme Court cases limited the reach of this legislation, the legislation that I've been talking about, the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act. First, and one of the most cited court cases in the media today is Citizens United v. Federal Elections Commission. It was decided in 2010. The U.S. Supreme Court held that the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting independent political expenditures for nonprofit corporations, for-profit corporations, labor unions, any other independent association. Many voters who oppose this decision, a lot of them, and this isn't across the board, but a lot of them are concerned that a particular organization or group can influence politicians through donations, can influence specifically politicians' decisions when they're voting through donations. Mostly, though, many argue that entities like organizations, corporations, these businesses, that they can't be protected under the First Amendment because they aren't people. And protecting them under the First Amendment would mean that they are indeed people. The BRCA imposed more limits. I think I keep mixing up this acronym. I'm referring to the very same legislation throughout all of this. Anyway, it imposed more limits on individual contributions to campaigns. But this provision on limiting individual contributions was actually overturned by the Supreme Court decision, McCutcheon v. Federal Elections Commission. Now, in this decision, the decision was, can the act place more limits on individual contributions to campaigns? Does it limit, because money, in a sense, some would argue, is your form of speech. You're showing your support by giving your money. And the court ruled, and in fact, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in the majority opinion that, quote, the government may no more restrict how many candidates or causes a donor may support than it can tell a newspaper how many candidates it can endorse. Although, there are still some limitations to how much an individual can give. In fact, Justice Clarence Thomas, the most conservative on the Supreme Court, if you remember, concurred with Chief Justice Roberts' decision, but he wrote a separate entry because he wanted to say that he believed this decision should go even further. And he wrote that, quote, limiting the amount of money a person may give to a candidate does impose a direct restraint on his political communication. So you're limiting that person's First Amendment rights. Now, if you want to know who's giving to whom in terms of political donations, the information is really barely transparent. According to Bianco and Cannon, though, research tells us that if a company or organization is giving to a candidate, it's doing so because they already support the candidate and his or her stances. Now, what does this mean? Well, this means that essentially a company's donation would have little effect on the behavior of an elected official if the elected official was going to vote in favor of what the company wants to begin with. Again, little effect on the elected official because they already have the same ideas and they already support the same causes. Last. All right, so let's talk about what you should do during election time. What I mean is, should you vote? I've mentioned before that political scientists generally believe there's no utility gained in voting. Essentially, your vote doesn't really count unless there's a split decision equally, just straight down the middle. There's a straight tie and your vote's going to break that tie. Or maybe you live in an area where there are only 2 people voting. The thing is, it takes time to gather information on candidates, to decide on who to vote for, to drive to the polls, to wait in line at the polls, and so on. I mean, these seem kind of nitpicky, but these are costs. And this leads political scientists to ask, why would anyone vote given that voting is costly and the chances of affecting the outcome is so small? It's a paradox, really. So that's what we call it. That is the paradox of voting. The paradox of voting is the question of why anyone would vote given that voting is costly and the chances of affecting the outcomes are so small. It just simply doesn't make sense for people to vote based on that. The best we can come up with is this, though. It's a function within this calculation, this whole cost and benefits of voting thing. And we add in another function to be, added into it called a d-term. We call it a d-term because it's just a variable that we don't know what it stands for. In an equation that measures the rationale to vote, the d-term accounts for reasons that may tip the equation in favor of making it rational for somebody to vote. Yes, it is costly to vote, but maybe your d-term is civic duty. And that really, really good, warm, fuzzy feeling that you get from fulfilling your civic duty makes up for any cost of voting. Your d-term could be that you care so much about this candidate, this particular candidate, that it would make you feel so good to vote for that candidate. And that good feeling you have from voting for that candidate would outweigh any costs. It could be that your parents are Democrats and they are very staunchly Democrats, and you want to make them very angry. And your D term then is to make them angry by voting Republican. The more angry you can make them, the more it outweighs the cost of voting. So I don't support that. You shouldn't do things just to make your parents mad. But it could be anything. My point is the D term can be anything. Anything that makes us want to vote. Because we're all rational actors. Hopefully. We all do things. By rational, I mean we have a goal and we are trying to achieve that goal. And that goal is rarely making us less happy. All right, so I've mentioned before, uncovering why people vote is really perplexing, but uncovering how people decide to vote is not quite as confusing. Although I'm not sure that I really like how your book explains it, so let's just go through it real quick. I've mentioned before that most of us are what is called single-issue voters. This term is not in your book, but you should certainly know it. These are people who are really informed about one particular policy preference, and they vote based on a candidate's stance on that issue. Now, don't get this confused with what Bianco and Cannon call issue voters. What they call issue voters, I refer to as simply an informed voter. This is someone who takes the time to gather information about all the candidates. They know and understand their policy preferences in relation to the policy preferences of the candidates, and then they make an informed decision to vote, and who to vote for too. And this is how we hope most people vote, but unfortunately, that's probably not true. Most of us take informational shortcuts when making a decision on who to vote for, because it just simply takes too much time to do all of that I said before. Gather all the information about candidates, really understand your policy preferences, because to do that you have to understand the policies, and then understand how your policy preferences relate to the policy preferences of the candidate. All of that's really hard. So we take informational shortcuts, also referred to as voting cues, to help us decide on who to vote for. Your book gives you a list of possible voting cues. They can be any of the following. Number 1, whether or not the candidate is an incumbent. This could be your voting cue. If so, maybe just vote for the one that's already in office. Obviously, people thought he was doing a good job because they put him in office to begin with. So just keep voting for him or her. Number 2, vote for the candidate that matches your party affiliation. If you're a Democrat, she's a Democrat, maybe you can assume that you and her are alike on most issues. Third, it could be really personal. This cue is some sort of interaction or good experience that you've had with a candidate. So maybe the person you're voting for has helped you get assistance from a government agency. Maybe they've gotten your favorite community center federal funds to rebuild a better facility. In that case, because they were really nice to you, you return the favor by giving them your vote. Sometimes we vote based on personal characteristics that match our own. This isn't any more complicated than it sounds. Do they look like me? Do they act like me? Maybe they're the same race as me, practice the same religion. Maybe they're the same gender. If so, maybe I should vote for them. Or him or her. All right. Number 5, retrospective evaluations. One of the most common cues we use. We focus on, when we're using this cue, we focus on whether or not we approve of votes that a candidate made in previous circumstances. If we approve of the votes that they made, we vote for that person. If we don't approve, we give our vote to someone else. The 6th cue, and the last one, maybe, despite your party affiliation, you don't like the way government's working out. So you decide you're going to vote for whichever party is not in the majority of government. So if you aren't happy with government and the majority in government are Republicans, you will vote Democrat. If it's Democrats that are in the majority of government and you don't like how government's going, you vote Republican. Admittedly, some of these reasons sound a little silly, but they often work as really viable shortcuts for individuals whenever they vote. All right, well, this concludes the online lecture on elections. If you have any questions, you can always let me know by emailing me or asking me after class. I'll be happy to talk with you about it or clear anything up. Until then, thank you for listening.